All of us in this class bring to the text we read a specific set of ideas, tastes, and assumptions. This semester, we're going to give names to these assumptions and figure out how to move beyond our own comfort zones as readers, past the knee-jerk responses that we tend to have to specific kinds of text. I like to think about literary theory as game playing with words. So we'll be trying out one critical lens, seeing what we can do with it, maybe discarding it and exchanging it for another lens that works better. Thinking about this is as a game, or even as a literary experiment, means that you don't become wedded to one way of seeing a text, to one way a text has meaning. Rather, you're looking at a bunch of different possible meanings and then choosing from among them. So a question that you're going to be asking throughout the semester as you're reading familiar texts and new ones is which theory or method shows us something important about a text that we may not have seen without it. Our first lens is going to be new criticism, which is a relatively recent approach to literary text that began in the mid-20th century, when it was first developed by critics I.A. Richards, William Empson, Cleanth Brooks, who wrote The Well-Wrought Urn, and Robert Penn Warren. New criticism emphasizes close examination of an autonomous, unified text. So the new critic is not going to be concerned with biography, history, or anything that any external influence on the production of a text. So close reading is going to be at its center, which is defined as, quote, the detailed analysis of a text itself to arrive at an interpretation without referring to historical, authorial, or cultural concerns. So the new critic is going to basically just reject the old historicist's attention to the biographical, the sociological, and instead propose that these objective observations about how a piece works can be made through a closer focus rather than specialized knowledge. So the new critic is going to build on ideas from Russian formalism, which considered relationships between a text's ideas and its form, between what a text says and how it says it. So in other words, a new critic is going to see form and content as inseparable. The new criticism was also a direct response to claims that literary study was subjective, right? My opinion is all that matters, and therefore less valuable to claims that less valuable than science, the scientific method. And in this way, this is a movement toward science of literature with a unique and often technical vocabulary, some of which is taught in high school still. Third-person omniscient, new critics work with patterns of sound, imagery, narrative structure, point of view, other techniques that kind of emphasize close reading of a self-contained work. So the new critic is going to focus on things like subtlety, unity, integrity of a text apart from author's intent, which is, they claim, neither available nor desirable. So that interview with J.K. Rowling about the latest Harry Potter book is not going to be of interest to a new critic because it will not allow us to see the unity and larger meaning of a work. The new critic asserts that meaning exists solely on the page itself. So to do a new critical reading, you will look for things like complexity, paradox, irony, ambiguity, all of which lead to a unifying idea or theme that ultimately resolves the tensions of the text. So the terms that will be useful in thinking about new criticism are close reading, which is a rereading for the purpose of recognizing detail, nuance of text that goes unnoticed when you read a text for the first time. So this is going to require at least multiple rereadings to have a new understanding or insight into the text. Intentional fallacy is the confusion of meaning of a text with the author's intent. So looking at an author's letters, diaries, interviews for keys to reading her work would not be of interest to the new critic. Affective fallacy is to confuse the meaning of a text with how it makes the reader feel, which is something we'll be talking about when we get to reader response. So a reader's emotional response to a text generally does not produce a reliable interpretation, according to the New Critic. Heresy of paraphrase, it's a false assumption that interpreting a literary work could consist solely of summary or paraphrase. Cleanth Brooke explains that poems don't produce statements or didactic messages in and of themselves. So the irony, the ambiguity that we see in these texts resists very simple or reductive readings. Opponents of new criticism will claim that this lens flattens out literary texts because it ignores the larger context in which they were created. For example, post-structuralists like Paul de Man and deconstructionists like Stanley Fish and Harold Bloom, they argue that tension, irony, and contradiction in a text ultimately lead to instability, not harmony. So when you're reading this week these poems, you want to be asking questions like, who is speaking? What does this poem look like on the page? Is there a recognizable meter or rhyme scheme that seems significant to the meaning of the poem? My Papa's Waltz, for example, connects the title with the movement throughout the poem and the meter, which is a waltz. And what larger themes does the poem express through these choices? And finally, what remains unclear at the end of the poem? Are the tensions that the text creates resolved?